Hey there, Latin One. Sorry I got cut off in the Google Meet earlier. It kind of crashed on me. And I was in the middle of explaining how the Romans actually got involved in Britain in the first place. Your book does a great job of explaining sort of like the cultural conflict between Romans and Britons and the idea of Romanization, but they kind of gloss over how the Romans got involved with Britain to begin with. So that's what I was in the middle of explaining. Forgive me if this is a little bit of a repeat for the 60 some odd of you who might have heard it. You can just kind of skip ahead until you find where we stopped. So, the Roman world, this is the map of the greatest extent of the Roman Empire. You can see just how vast it was. But when the Romans first encountered Britannia, yes, they had a little bit of Spain, and they had obviously all of Italy, a tiny little bit over here, and they had some of Greece. And then this big area right here, Gallia, aka modern France, was in the process of being conquered by the Romans, by a specific Roman, whom I'll get to in a minute. And it was during that time when the Romans first encountered the Britons. So, who was the Roman who was here fighting in Gaul? He actually fought there for 10 long years, none other than our boy JC, Julius Caesar. And he actually invaded Britain twice in the year 55 BC and in the year 54 BC. By the way, I don't know if you can tell, but he combed his hair over. He was going bald, and he felt very insecure about it, and so he would use some oil and whatnot and slick his hair. World's first comb over. Probably not first, but pretty strange. Anyway, so JC is over here in Gaul fighting, and in the year 55, he's in his winter camp, and he's way up here where this little the pen is right here. And he keeps wondering to himself, how are these tribes that I'm fighting against way up here, how are they continuing to get reinforcements? And he learns that perhaps they're getting reinforcements from this island that's right across the channel called Britannia. So he wants to explore it. He gets a small fleet together. They leave the winter camp and they start sailing over to Britannia. Well, there's like a big storm that happens, and then anyway, etc., etc. He manages to get close to where he needs to be. He doesn't have all of his men with him, and he first encounters the Brits in this particular way. He looks as his boats are sailing towards what looks to be a natural harbor, and he looks and he sees these giant, naked, blue men running down the hill at him, many of whom are in chariots, and they're throwing a whole bunch of stuff, a whole bunch of missiles at him and all of his men, and the Romans are freaking out. Okay, so let's deconstruct giant, naked, blue men. So Roman men back in the time of the late Roman Republic were short. How short were they? Probably about 5'4", somewhere around there, perhaps a bit less. And Celtic men, we don't know how tall they were, but they were certainly taller on average than Romans. And so Romans had to physically look up to see these Celtic warriors. Now, the Celtic warriors would often fight completely naked, and they found that to be an intimidating tactic. And they would also put blue paint all over their bodies. Julius Caesar also tells us, because he kept a diary of all of this, if he's to be believed, and that's a big if, he also tells us that they plucked all their body hair out except for the hair on top of their head. So it's naked, blue, hairless giants coming down the hill throwing stuff. Of course, the Romans are scared. Now, the other thing I mentioned was the fact that lots of these Celtic warriors were fighting on chariots. This is something the Romans had not actually seen in battle in hundreds of years. It would be like if our soldiers were to encounter somebody that they were fighting against, and that group of people that they were fighting against, rolled out like a cannon, right? Our troops would be like, what is that? That's kind of weird. And oh my gosh, this cannonball is heading towards us. Oh gosh, we better get out of the way. Now, these chariot fighters were very, very well trained, and each chariot had a chariot driver and then someone who actually did the fighting. And what would happen is, in the battlefield, the chariots would drive all over the battlefield and really confuse the enemy, in this case the Romans. And oftentimes, they would just sort of weave in and out of different groups of soldiers, and the fighter in the back of the chariot would be stabbing people, stab, 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 or throwing spears. According to Caesar, again, if he's to be believed on this, the chariot fighter would balance himself on the yoke that joins the horses to the chariot itself, would balance himself and go around stabbing and throwing spears, and then if he came under attack, he would essentially do a backflip while the chariot driver would duck down. He would do a backflip and then land feet first in the back of the chariot, completely unharmed. The chariots would also go around the battlefield and kind of stop and let the chariot fighter get out. He would run up and stab, stab, stab somebody, and then he would just run and hop right back in the chariot, and boom, the chariot would run away. A little drive-by, hit-and-run style. So the Romans are very ill-equipped to handle all this, but somehow they do manage to make it on shore, but not very far. And Caesar and his men only stay there for about, I don't know, 3 weeks or so, and then they decide, let's go back to Gaul. This place seems strange. Now Caesar is a stubborn man, and he just can't, he stews on this for a whole year. So in the very next year, 54 BC, he decides to go back. This time he takes a larger fleet with him, and they do manage to make some inroads into this southeastern part of Britain. They don't get very far. They stay for longer than a couple of weeks this time, but not too much longer. He does kind of get to know some more of the tribes, some various kings who rule those tribes. He learns more about the people who live in this area where I'm pointing. But eventually he kind of signs a couple of treaties with some folks, packs up and leaves, and decides these people are crazy. They're just not worth it. So he goes back to Rome eventually, gets stabbed, 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 which you all know. And eventually his grandnephew kind of comes out on top after a long period of civil war. And his grandnephew, his birth name Octavian, but he changes his name to Augustus, becomes Rome's first emperor and starts a dynasty of rulers called the Julio-Claudian emperors. Okay, now notice how Augustus ruled for a very long time, 27 BCE, or BC rather, to 14 AD, and during that entire time, he did not want anything to do with Britain. He thought that his great-uncle's attempt to conquest was pretty ridiculous in Britain. So Augustus is credited, somewhat controversially, because the reality is a lot more complicated, but he's generally credited with bringing peace and stability to the Roman world, and of course instituting the government of empire. Now when he dies of old age, almost 80 years old at that point, all of the male heirs, he only had a daughter, he didn't have any sons, but then his daughter had sons. All the male heirs that were supposed to be his successor, they all managed to die, oftentimes under mysterious circumstances. The ancient historians say that Augustus's wife, Livia, actually poisoned most of them. And why? Because she had a son from a previous marriage named Tiberius, so that would be Augustus's stepson, and she really wanted Tiberius to be the ruler. And sure enough, by the time Augustus dies in 14, he kind of looks around right before he dies, and he's like, well, the only person that's left is my stepson, whom I hate, Tiberius, but I guess he's going to be my successor. So then Tiberius becomes the second Roman emperor. You can see he rules for a good while as well, 14 to 37. Still, doesn't want anything to do with Britain. Now, when Tiberius dies, he is succeeded by this guy. It's not Tiberius' son. I believe it's his nephew as well. And his name was Caligula. And in Caligula, you can see, only ruled for a short amount of time. Now, there's a lot of controversy about what the ancient historians say about Caligula versus what actually happened. We don't actually know what happened, of course. But the Roman historians make some pretty ridiculous claims about how crazy he was. You can read all about them if you like. Some more PG-ish ones that I can mention here are that he decided to make his horse co-consul of Rome one day with a big ceremony. He also woke up one day, supposedly, and decided that he was Jupiter, the sun god, and demanded that people worship him. One time he was fighting against the Germans and supposedly went and fought the sea, ordered his soldiers to put a whole bunch of seashells in treasure chests. They went back to Rome, and Caligula claimed to the Senate and the people that he had conquered Germany, and that his men were going to show the Romans the spoils of war that they had captured. And his soldiers went and dumped over box after box after box of seashells on the Senate floor, and the senators were like, oh, this guy's got to go. He's crazy. So he gets assassinated in the year 41. Now, when he's assassinated, he didn't have any, well, he did have some children, but the assassins actually killed him, his wife, and his kids, pretty barbarically actually. Anyway, so the assassins who were part of like the Emperor's secret service, they go around in the palace looking to see who in the world could be the emperor, and they find a man who has urinated on himself, soiled himself, hiding behind a curtain. And who is it? Well, it's none other than our man Claudius, the fourth emperor of Rome, and he's really important in terms of Britannia. So as you can see, Claudius ruled from 41 to 54 AD, and just a couple of years into his reign is when he invaded Britannia, at this time for the Romans to stay. In fact, he named his son Britannicus around that time. Now, Claudius, oh, poor Claudius, he was born with some developmental challenges. He walked with a limp pretty much his entire life. He stuttered a lot, and he had sort of a nervous tic. Sometimes he had a problem controlling his drooling habits. He had a problem controlling his flatulence and things of that nature. If you don't know what that means, look it up. And anyway, everybody in the imperial household thought that he was an idiot, complete idiot, and they just ostracized him. But here's the thing, he was actually very, very smart. He was a historian. He wrote several history texts of sort of a group of people called the Etruscans that were sort of like the forebears of the Romans, among other things. He wrote lots of different history books, and many of the historians of his time respected his writing, and they knew that he was a smart man, and they often gave him the advice, hey, just act as dumb as possible and you will survive. And sure enough, when his successor Caligula was really going crazy and kind of killing lots of people at random, Claudius did manage to survive. So, Claudius was Caligula's uncle, by the way. And so the secret service of Rome made Claudius the emperor because they thought that they could control him. They thought he was just an idiot. But he proved them wrong. Now, he, not being an idiot, he realized that the only way that he was going to win over the Roman people, who thought it was ridiculous that he had been made emperor, was by some sort of military victory. And so he decided, why not go back to my great whatever, Julius Caesar, why not go back to his original plan and invade Britannia? So he gathered a massive force and sure enough went over into Britain in the year 43. And the Romans fought very, very hard, and the Celtic tribes fought equally as hard against them in this southern region right here, the southeastern region. It was not at all sort of conquered by the time that Claudius died. The Romans were still fighting very heavily. Now, Claudius died because he didn't really pick his wives very well. One of his wives, by the way, a woman named Messalina, apparently had essentially like a sexathon with Rome's leading prostitute. It was like, which one of us, the empress or this prostitute, can sleep with the most number of people in a 24-hour period? And Messalina won, and Claudius found out and had to have her killed. Then his final wife was actually his niece, disgusting, Agrippina the Younger, that's her name. And Agrippina had a son from a previous marriage that she really wanted to be emperor and not Claudius's own son, Britannicus. She couldn't wait any longer, and so supposedly, according to the ancient historians, she poisoned Claudius's mushrooms, his afternoon snack of mushrooms. He dies in the year 54 before Britannia is subdued for the Romans, and of course it's her son, Agrippina's son, Nero. Look at that little beard there, that little chin strap beard. Nero, who comes to power and rules from 54 to 68 AD. Now, when he takes the throne, he's still pretty young, and so his mother, along with his teacher, a guy named Seneca, and some others, kind of guide him those first few years. And, you know, they're somewhat successful in trying to guide him. Eventually, though, he kind of becomes crazy, and you've probably heard some of the stories. If not, look them up. So, now when Nero comes to power, a lot of the Celtic tribes, especially in this area right here, the Iceni and whatnot, really use that as a way to revolt against the Romans. And so pretty much all throughout Nero's reign, there was still very fierce fighting in this area of Britannia. And then after after he took his own life, he would have been killed had he not done so. Eventually, this area of southeastern, mostly, Britannia becomes relatively stable in terms of the Romans conquering it. Now, over here in modern day parts of modern day Wales, and especially up here in Scotland with the Caledonians, those tribes continued to fight very, very fiercely against the Romans for quite some time. And in fact, when our stories are taking place in our textbook, it's about the year 81 or 82 AD, and these areas are not at all pacified. In fact, they're in open revolt against the Romans. By the way, just random story about Nero. I just want to show you this picture right here. Nero, after a while, decided that he didn't want to be mothered anymore. And at that point is when he really started to go crazy. And so he decided to kill his mother using a trick boat. Please don't apply logic. She was basically going to get on this boat, and there was like a little trap door that was going to open up, and she was going to fall in the water and drown. And so everything goes according to plan, except Nero, kind of not being the brightest bulb, didn't realize that his mother could swim really well. And so you could see, look at that expression of anger on her face. She swims to shore after this trick boat, and she knows exactly what's happened, and that Nero has tried to kill her. And as soon as she gets ashore, she starts cursing out Nero. And what does he do? He orders his bodyguards just to go down to the shore and stab, stab, stab her. And after that, things went downhill for him. And then you had several Roman generals openly revolt against him in the year 68, and then Nero put an end to his own life. Now, the Roman general, by the way, that ended up coming up on top was a guy named Vespasian. He had two children, Titus and Domitian, and now in stage 13 in the Blue Book, set around 81, 82, we are in basically the first year or first 2 years of the Emperor Domitian's reign. So that's a little bit of how the Romans got involved in Britain in the first place. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.